Good afternoon, and welcome to Payentry's biweekly HR webinar. Today, our topic is background checks, and I will be talking through that with you. My name is Cathy Graham, and I am the VP of HR Services here at the Payentry office in Huntersville. Look forward to meeting you at some point in the future or helping you with something HR related. Today, we're going to talk about what's a background check. We're going to talk about why you even want to conduct background checks in the first place. Why is that important? We're going to talk a little bit about the legal aspects, the types of background checks that you can actually do, and how we implement a background check. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me. So if you cannot hear me, please type in the chat window, and I will be happy to see if I can fix that. But we're going to move forward now. These webinars that I've been conducting since March of this year are typically no more than 30 minutes long, just to let you know, because I know that you as payroll or HR people are very busy, office managers. We have all types of people that join in on this session, and I know you guys don't have a ton of time to spend looking at your screen because you're busy working. So just let me know if you have any questions during the session. Go ahead and type them into the chat area, the chat box, and I will answer those at the end of this session. Again, after the session is over too, you can get a copy of this on our website, or you can email me and I will send a copy of it to you directly to your email. So let's go ahead and talk about what is a background check. Oh, excuse me, we missed one. Why is compliance so much harder now? And that has a lot to do with the legal aspect of this. So what's a background check? A background check is a process that companies use to check a person's history, their criminal record, their education, their employment history, and any other past activities that are important in order to confirm the qualifications for the position, actually their identity, and whether or not they should be a good candidate for your job. 96% of employers in the United States regularly conduct background checks. So almost everyone, and I think if I took a vote right now, almost everyone on the line, probably 96% of you would be conducting background checks. But it's important to know why you do them and how to do them properly. One reason is to improve the quality of your hires. If you hire and you are going to take at face value the person's background and their ability to do the job and their, other things that might calculate into making a good hiring decision would be invisible to you. Usually a background check will verify the Social Security number and the name of the individual in order to make sure they are who they say they are. There's a lot of identity theft that goes on, even in the employment world, so it is important to do that. Also to ensure that this person is not being fraudulently claiming someone else's Social Security number. It also, for the employer, verifies the background of the person, the education and the employment history. That shows whether or not the person basically meets your job description needs or your job requirement needs. It presents criminal history, if any, for considerations. I think we'll talk about this in a minute, but there are many states now, actually 12 states, that have banned your request for criminal history on your application. There is a federal rule that's been talked about that may come into play later this year that would eliminate that question on your application at the federal level. So for all federal employers, and usually that means that the other employers that are private employers follow through with that. It also verifies any professional licenses that a person professes to have. If it's important for them to have certain engineering or other typical HR even professional certifications, then this would be a way for you to verify that the person actually holds those licenses. So background checks, 96% of the companies out there conduct them. They are not cheap. It's not, so it does add to your budget, but why do you conduct these background checks? Another reason is to avoid business risk and loss. You don't want to hire someone that was just arrested for embezzling from their prior employer. And obviously, that may or may not have an impact on the job that you're hiring them for. If you're hiring someone to, let's just say, being a training coordinator, and there's no handling of money, you may not be able to exclude that person from the hiring process, but at least you're aware of the fact that there's a background of theft. Negligent hiring is something we hear about all the time, where a company hires someone that they knew, or I'm sorry, that they did not know has a DWI or two on their in their background, in their history. You hire this person to drive your truck, and this person gets into an accident and hurts someone or damages someone's property. That would be considered a claim against you as the employer, because you should have known that that person was had that background and should not be driving your truck and could cause an accident. So employers are much more conscious of looking at backgrounds, especially for drivers and people who are going to handle money, to see if there is any reason to eliminate them from the job or the hiring process. Also, workplace injury. If someone has been was at another job and they were let go because of workplace violence or threatening behavior, then that may not show up in a background check. It might. That sometimes gets into a reference check basis. But if they have been arrested for assault in another workplace, that's something definitely you would want to know about before hiring them. Another reason to conduct background checks is to protect your employees, your customers, and the public in general. Workplace harassment. Um, and again, this may not show up in a background check, but it could very well in a reference, or it could be that someone has been charged with assault or some criminal behavior. But workplace harassment, that's one. Workplace injury, again, looking at what if they've been charged with anything before. Personal injury and theft. So they could be someone who has been arrested in the past or are charged with embezzlement or theft of client funds. One of the biggest reasons that you do conduct background checks is to protect your company reputation and your culture. Negative community image. Excuse me. Well, something's going on here. Okay. A negative community image. If you hire someone, let's just say that is a driver, and you are charged with negligent hiring when that person gets into an accident and causes damage, then the community may hear about that through the newspaper or the evening news. Sometimes that's the biggest story out there, so you're going to be headlining, and you don't want that. You want to make sure that your employees are all characters, people with good character that reflect a positive attribute to your company. And the impact to an applicant, as far as the perception of your culture. If you have a negative community image, it may be hard for you to hire people because they perceive you as an employer that doesn't follow the rules. And again, turnover and impact of on morale of existing staff. If you have a workplace violence incident, which is becoming way, way too common nowadays, um, or you have someone who ends up being a problem employee, that does have an impact on the morale of your existing staff. It impacts the culture that they feel, and it can cause turnover. So what are the legal aspects of background checks? Well, the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, um, files a ton of these or takes in a lot of discrimination charges each year. They review these claims of discrimination in hiring practices and employment practices, and when someone wants to file a charge against you for discrimination in your hiring practices, you're excluding anyone that has a criminal background, regardless of the job, or you're excluding a particular, not because out of choice, but just because you have your the way that you're excluding minorities from your hiring because they are impacted adversely by the practices that you have in place. That can cause a problem with the EEOC. Lawsuits are very common, unfortunately, and very expensive. I just worked for a large company that I was just looking on the EEOC's website the other day, and they just settled a claim for $2.5 million. It wasn't one person, it was a number of people who had filed a class action suit because they felt like they weren't being considered for jobs at certain levels because of their race and their gender. So it's very important to know that the lawsuits out there range anywhere from 25,000 to millions of dollars, but you also got attorney fees on top of it too. So these are things that you want to really pay attention to because it can be very expensive if you don't. The Fair Credit and Reporting Act is another legal entity that has a say-so in background checks. This applies to all background checks, regardless of whether there's a credit check included. It requires that your employer not use background information to discriminate. And you say that well, we don't discriminate. Well, if you're excluding anyone with a criminal background or you're excluding, which may adversely impact a minority group, or you're, excluding anyone who has a criminal history in driving, and that person's not required to drive in their job. Bottom line, though, whatever reason you have for not hiring that person should not be anything that would not be related to the job. For example, if you're hiring someone, as I just mentioned, as a driver, and I'm sorry, not as a driver, you're hiring someone as a secretary. I think we still have those in the workplace now. Let's just say administrative assistant. But you see that that person has a DWI on their work history or in their, I'm sorry, in their criminal background check. You could not hire that person because they had a DWI. That would be a condition for someone to say that you were discriminating against them. That doesn't happen often, but you need to be careful that the requirements that you have for the job match the job that you're actually trying to fill. So if someone is working, for example, in a receptionist position, and you find out that they just got out of prison for embezzlement. Well, if that receptionist never handles funds, money, then that should not enter into your decision to hire or not to hire. can't just blanket say that if someone has a criminal background that you're not going to hire them. You have to treat all individuals equally, regardless of the race, gender, religion, or disability. So don't single out um, a position for and say that they have to all be male or female um, or of a certain race. You have to make sure that if you're going to do a background check on your employees, you need to do it across the board for the most part. Otherwise, you could end up with a charge of disability. I'm sorry, of discrimination. This also includes rules for disclosure to applicants before and after the process. If you do a background check on someone, there are disclosures that you make to them before you conduct the background check and after you finish the process if you're not going to hire them. The Fair Credit and Accurate Credit Transactions Act is another legal entity or law that governs this type of activity. It's an amendment to what we just talked about, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and the primary purpose here is to protect your consumers from identity theft. It stipulates the requirements for information as it regards to privacy, accuracy, and disposal of the information that you actually collect in a background check. And it limits the ways that that information can be shared. So let's talk a little bit about the type of background checks that you can use in your environment. One are employment background checks. 72% of all employers run a background check, an employment background check for all new hires. That's to check to see if they actually worked where they said they worked and for the period of time that they worked. That usually covers the past 7 years. Some of the states out there allow more than that, but generally when you use a vendor to do a background check, they are going to look at the past 7 years. There's some sources that they look at for these background checks. Some of the pieces of the employment background check can include, obviously the work history. You can use social media to do that, criminal records, credit history, education, and the drug screening piece of this. I see one thing on this chart that I have a little bit of a disagreement with is the medical history. You really should not be asking anyone about their medical history during a background check. If it may be that, if you're hiring nurses for hospitals, you might need to know about the types of immunizations that they've had, if they're current on those, if they, have some other restrictions for working in a nursing capacity or in a healthcare capacity. I know that the healthcare field does have a few of those, so that could be the reason that you would want to do that. Other types of background checks include E-Verify. This is a voluntary process, and it's used to verify identity and employment eligibility of newly hired employees. It compares the information that you get on an I-9 form with government records. So a number of employers have decided to use E-Verify, and then there are some requirements to use it in certain situations. But this is a service that you could add on to a background check that would give you some proof of whether or not the person was eligible to work in the country. The I-9 form is obviously mandatory for all employers in the United States. It doesn't require Social Security number, photo ID, and however, it is used to re-verify expired employment authorizations. But the E-Verify, the benefit of that is it requires a Social Security number, requires a photo ID, and cannot be used to re-verify expired employment authorization. So there are some benefits to using that in addition to the I-9 that could be beneficial for your group. There is, again, a criminal history background check that can be run, and depending on the industry, regulations may exist that prohibit hiring certain felons, and there are some of those in the healthcare field. If you've been um, charged with Medicare fraud or assault, those kinds of things, you can't work in certain facilities from a healthcare standpoint. The conviction should not be considered unless it's relevant to the job being offered, and I think I mentioned that in, a little ways back, but it has to be relevant to the job being offered, or you can't use it to not hire the person. To create job opportunities, the federal government has begun offering incentives, and this has been going on for a while. The Work Opportunity Tax Credit, we call it WOTC. Payentry has the ability to do that for you as an employer. To create what it does is it gives you a tax credit for felons that you employ, and it can be substantial. So if you haven't looked into that before, it does provide a great offset for the first year, I think, when you're hiring someone. And your service rep here can help you explore that. A background check on a criminal level normally consists of searching national criminal databases, sex offender registries, county criminal courts, and looking at domestic and global terrorist watch lists. Gosh, that, years ago you would never see that on a background check, but today it's very important. And then it looks at federal and state criminal records. An OIG background check is what I think I mentioned a little bit earlier for healthcare facilities. It's an Office of the Inspector General. There is a sanctions list, and that list in that office has a list of people who have committed crimes that involve healthcare. And if they're on that sanctions list, they're not supposed to be allowed to work in a federally funded healthcare program. That would include Medicare or Medicaid fraud, patient abuse or neglect, felony conviction related to controlled substances, and for other healthcare related fraud, theft, or misconduct, financial misconduct. And then a credit background check. This type of a background check requires written permission from the applicants and a formal notice of how the information is going to be used. If the person is not hired, let me back up. Remember, it's written permission. It does not appear on your application. It has to be a separate form. If you need one of these forms, I can get that for you, or you can go on HR Answers on your Payentry system and pull it from there, but I'll be happy to help you with that. But then again, if you don't hire the person, they have to receive follow-up information. It's considered a notice of adverse action, which means you're not getting the job. So you have to tell them the reason. You have to show them a copy of the report, and you have to provide them with a copy of the summary of your rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So these are things that are requirements. If you're using a third-party vendor to do this, they probably are doing all of that for you, but you need to check. In all of my webinars that I talk about legal issues, if you have an outside vendor helping you with something, you need to make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing, or that they are following through on everything they committed to, and that they're federally qualified to do that. So if you don't have a background check program in place now, how do you go about doing that? First of all, you develop a written policy. Be consistent. Apply to all who interviewed for an open position. So if you have there may be jobs within your organization that you don't feel you need a background check for, maybe a receptionist or someone, but most people do it for all new hires. But make sure that if you have an open position, that you apply that background check to all of those that you interview for that open position, so that there's no claim of discrimination. Make sure, obviously, that you're treating everyone equally. In human resources, consistency is the key. Across the board consistency in every policy that you have. Make sure you use a consumer reporting agency that's actually accredited. NAPBS is one of the main ones. That's a very good one to use. And to wrap it up, why is compliance harder now? Because it is. There is increased oversight by the EEOC. They have hired more auditors. They have employees that know that they can file these. It's much more common now for your employees to have knowledge of this, or your applicants to have knowledge of this. In fact, the EEOC, if someone comes in and files a claim that you've discriminated against them in the hiring practices, they will ask you for the records on anyone else that you interviewed for that position or any other positions, and they can create a class action lawsuit based on the information that you give them. So it's not just that a bunch of people run out there and say, oh, they're discriminating against me. The EEOC will actually come in based on one complaint and do an audit to see if you're applying that negative practice across the board. So increased oversight does mean increased discrimination claims. Also, the new ban the box laws, I mentioned this earlier, prohibit asking a question about the criminal background on your application. If you still have this on your application, or you want me to take a look at your application, I'll be happy to do that for you. But there are 12 states, and obviously California, Massachusetts, and New York are on that list. Washington's on that list. I don't know all of them at the top of my head, but if you want to know if your state is included in that, please shoot me an email and I'll find out for you. But this is being approached by the federal government, so it looks as though that should come off of your application regardless. It's just kind of a thing that's coming in the future. There are a lot of grassroots state and local laws too. So today I've talked pretty much about federal laws, but the states are very and local. Even San Francisco and some of the other cities in the United States, like New York City, they have separate laws about all of this, a background check or ban the box, prohibiting the hiring of felons and things of that nature. So you need to pay attention to what's happening in your state. If you don't know, call me and I'll do some research for you. That's part of the service that I provide to you as a Payentry client. So that's the end of our session today. If you have any questions, if you'd like to type them into the chat box now, I'll be happy to answer those for you. We'll give it just a minute if you have any specific questions. Okay, if you don't, this will end our June 6th webinar, and you will be able to access this on our website. But if you don't and you're missing out on it, just give me a call or shoot me an email. I'll be happy to send it to you. Thanks for attending today's session. I look forward to seeing you on the 20th. June the 20th, we're going to be talking about let's see, what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the Bermuda Triangle of leaves, the ADA, the FMLA, and workers' compensation. This is important because these leaves overlap, and I'm going to answer some particular questions about how you treat your benefits and other things during that session. So we look forward to having you at the next session, and thanks for attending today.